Doug Keck, and welcome to EWTN's Bookmark. Our guest author is Karl Keating, and the book is Debating Catholicism, published by Rasselas House, available through our EWTN religious catalog. Well, I'm happy, Karl, for you to join us here as an author, and I'm happy I'm not debating you about Catholicism, and that's not what this book is about, but what is it?
It's a book that's really 4 books in one of transcripts edited of debates that I was in with anti-Catholics of a variety of persuasions, but mostly we could say fundamentalist in their attitude towards the Catholic Church.
Let me ask you, because I think about some of the, you've got Peter Ruckman, Jim Blackburn, Bart Brewer, and some of them I actually remember from listening to the audio tapes of the actual ones, especially Bart Brewer, because it was kind of embarrassing that he was a former priest.
Yes.
Because his knowledge of the faith seemed to be quite minimal, and he seemed like he was having trouble in his own life. At the time, seemed a little troubled. That being said, I mean, these kinds of people and these kinds of debates, is it the same questions over and over again, or are there new things going on today as well?
Both, really. Certain questions are perennial. The things I debated with these fellows, now I've edited the debates in such a way that there's no duplication too much from one debate to the next. But the things that we talked about, that we squabbled over regarding the Catholic faith, the Catholic history, were things that they were talking about 5 centuries ago, 10 centuries ago, 15 centuries ago, often, and that we're still talking about today. But today we have some other things now, you know, that are in the public eye and that are debatable, you know, they're worth discussing in a public venue.
Right. It's interesting, too, because like you said, you continue to have kind of that fundamentalist, though it seems like in many times evangelicals and Catholics, certainly on the pro-life areas and things, there's a lot more maybe agreement than there used to be even when you were first doing this, right?
That's right. When I got into apologetics nearly 40 years ago, there was a one-way street of Catholics leaving the church for fundamentalism and evangelicalism. Back in those days, 100,000 Catholics a year in America went just to the fundamentalist churches, even others into evangelical churches. That traffic now largely is it's two-way street or more of a one-way street in our direction. So things have changed to a large degree. But the same questions come up. And we still have people in non-Catholic churches who have been brought up innocently with the kind of prejudice or misunderstanding about the Catholic faith. And those folks need to know what the truth is.
You say, I tried to correct those misconceptions and adjust those imprecisions in the heat of public exchanges. I hope my limitations as a debater did not obscure the unity and sensibleness of the Catholic position. I hope the reader will find these pages instructive, consoling, and even amusing. And you mentioned that you did a little bit of editing, but you didn't change anything. And one other thing I thought was very interesting, the way you looked at it and said, well, I also looked at times where I thought maybe I could have had a better answer.
Well, I mentioned 2 things in particular. I preserve my opponent's best arguments. Okay, I haven't edited those out. I edited out the ums and the ahs and things like that.
And what are their cousins? What are ums and ahs cousins? You mentioned cousins. I'm not familiar with their cousins.
Ums, ahs, and things that maybe we shouldn't be saying on the air.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yes,
okay. I thought it was like Jesus' cousins or something.
That kind of cousins. No.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
So I cleaned up the transcripts and made them about uniform in length for the 4 constituent books in this book. So, what I wanted to do is to give their best arguments, but I also freely admit that there were times, in retrospect, I could have made a better argument. Either I didn't know the better argument, or it just didn't occur to me at the time. So I didn't clean up my own part of it either. I've left my failings in there.
Right.
I hope there aren't too many. But regardless of my limitations, I think the Catholic story carries itself. And that's at least I hope it does.
Well, let me talk about the whole idea. You got into apologetics in the late 80s there, kind of on your own. And in a sense, you almost think about EWTN sometimes. You think about the global Catholic Church in Rome and et cetera, and that in the Buckle of the Bible Belt in Irondale, Alabama, a little nun from Canton, Ohio, started this global Catholic network, which clearly has had a major impact on maintaining the faith in the United States, and I think to some degree helping to support it around the world.
Right.
That being the case, why does it always seem to be that where you would think this should be coming as a central theme right out from the center of the church, it's really many times lay people or people on the periphery who are actually leading the fight?
because they're often the ones that get the brunt of the problems. Okay, often those at the central areas of the church, whether at the parish level or even in Rome, whatever, are somewhat isolated from the day-to-day things that people meet. So in these debates, for example, the challenges that my opponents and I dealt with were everyday questions that Catholics will get. Catholics in the pews on Sundays would be getting these kinds of challenges. They didn't know how to answer them, which is why I went into the debates. But many of these things were not points of awareness to people, say, at the diocesan level or above. So it would make sort of sense that you would expect folks in the trenches to be dealing with these, and some of those, myself among them, would then become engaged in the matter and want to devote their lives to it.
It's interesting too, because I guess there's a certain amount of entrepreneurial aspect to it that someone like yourself has, where since you're not part of the hierarchical church directly, you can kind of, as a layperson, go ahead and do what you'd like to do within reason.
Yes, yeah, so there's a kind of liberty, and there's a challenge there, because some people who like that liberty like it too much, and it goes into license. You've always got to be thinking, I'm doing this not for my own behalf, but for the church.
Right.
Okay, and I don't want to make a hash of it.
Right.
Okay? But you have the liberty to take some chances, and to try some things out that the institutional church, just because of its nature, of it as an institution, would be slow ever to get around to doing.
Or where, because of other relationships and things that are going on in an ecumenical way, could be perceived as being unecumenical.
Yeah, although, you know, the folks that I debated here didn't give a hoot about ecumenism.
Well, that's interesting too, because your debates are against, let's say, fundamentalists, like you said, as opposed to, let's say, evangelicals, the kind of people who really believe the Lorraine Bettner kind of version of the Catholic Church, the Whore of Babylon, all those kind of things. Why wouldn't you ever have to debate somebody who was a mainline Protestant, or why weren't they interested in debating?
Well, I did have some. They're not in this book.
Okay.
There's a prominent Lutheran theologian, for example, whom I debated. Unfortunately, there was no transcript made of that particular debate, so I wasn't able to include it. I would have otherwise.
Okay. Is it also because of the fact that many times they're not worried about what the differences are anymore?
Partly, I think, because we're closer than we are, say, to the fundamentalists. A few years ago, I was working with an prominent evangelical pastor, and we were talking about doing a book together. But we had a bit of a problem finding enough disagreement to make it a lively book. At the time, he said that his chief interest was the Eucharist. He was becoming, as an evangelical, he's moving toward the Catholic position. He said at that point, he adopted the Eastern Orthodox understanding of the Eucharist, slightly different from the Catholic. But that was a topic he wanted to talk about in our book, but we were too close together.
Right.
See?
It's interesting, too, because I know when you were on with Father Mitch, you mentioned this, and I knew this from even somebody who worked at the Bible Answer Man, etc., that there seems to be this kind of drift from some of these evangelicals who kind of, it seems like they're afraid to swim the Tiber, so they end up going to Constantinople or something.
That's true. That's true. Because a lot of them have been brought up, as I say, with kind of hereditary prejudice. And it tends to be in two areas, the Virgin Mary and the papacy. Those are the two bugaboos for evangelicals and fundamentalists. And it's tough for them to overcome either one. And with respect to the papacy, the easiest way to not deal with it is to not deal with it.
Right.
And you can do that if you become Eastern Orthodox.
Now, when you debated Peter S. Ruckman, you described him as a character. In what way?
Ruckman was the chief of the so-called King James only movement within fundamentalism. The idea that you had to use the King James version of the Bible as distinguished from any other English translation. And as a matter of fact, only the original edition from 1611. When we met for the debate, it was at a Baptist church in Southern California. And I remember being introduced to him by the minister of the church. And Mr. Keating, here's Dr. Ruckman, shook hands. I said, "How do you do, sir? Nice to meet you." Harumph. And that's all he said. At the end of the debate, I spoke last, so he spoke next to last. And he said, "These will be my final remarks." He gave them. Instead of sitting down to listen to my final remarks, he walked out.
Okay.
And I had the impression at the time, You didn't want to shake my hands again because afraid of catching Catholic cooties.
Okay, Catholic cooties. I haven't heard cooties in a number of years since I was a kid. But would you also find with those things, it seemed like in reading through these various, you only have the 4 in here, but that usually you were speaking to an audience that was pretty well stacked against you,
always.
right?
One of the debates was against a minister, Jose Ventilacion, of a Filipino sect called Iglesia ni Cristo, which translates as Church of Christ. And this was held in a high school gymnasium. 3,500 people, 3,000 of the people in the audience were members of that denomination, bussed in from throughout Southern California. And it was a very unnerving experience for me. And not just because of the numbers of 3,000 of their people versus 500 Catholics and Protestants, but because when I sat down on the platform, I had my table, my opponent has his table, in between was the lectern. When I sat down, a fellow pulled up a folding chair next to me and I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm your bodyguard." I said, "My what?" He said, your bodyguard. When we have debates in the Philippines and they don't go well, sometimes our people storm the dais. I said, "Thanks a lot."
Okay.
Yeah.
Unlike fundamentalism, unlike even Mormonism and the Jehovah's Witnesses, this is a true cult.
Yes.
If you had seen the Iglesia people in the audience, if you'd seen how they reacted in lockstep to their leaders, you would have been understood that. At least that's the impression I got from my vantage point on the platform.
It was unnerving, I have to say. It was the only time I've given a public talk of any sort where I was a bit concerned for my safety. The people were actually glassy-eyed, staring back up at me. Iglesia is a sect that was established in 1914 in the Philippines. The man who founded it, Felix Manalo, claimed to have divine revelation. It has connections with the Jehovah's Witnesses in some of its theology. They don't believe in hell, for example, okay, and other things. They don't believe in the Trinity. Okay, so it's a strange religion. In a bit, it's like North Korea in that the grandson of the founder now heads it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So almost like Moonies in a sense.
In a way, but more of cultic, actually.
Really?
Yes.
It's interesting, too, because you make the point is that he had this divine revelation, but yet he needed to come to the United States to study with Protestants.
Yes. Well, the divine revelation came some years after the founding, because when he was gone studying in the U.S., there was a schism back home. He had to regain authority. So he claimed, oh, while I was still in the Philippines, I had divine revelation.
Oh, okay.
And that was enough to get him back to the leadership.
So that was a post facto kind of situation
That's
that he
right.
had here. Now in Jim Blackburn, which you talk about High Desert Showdown, you say, most of the professional anti-Catholics I've dealt with over the years more likely might be called city slickers than country bumpkins, even if most of them sported or at least affected that southern drawl commonly associated with fundamentalist preachers, even those who never seem to have visited south of the Mason-Dixon line. Then you cast some aspersions about Alabama here, but I won't go into it. What do you mean they were city slickers versus country bumpkins?
I think a fine example of that would be Bart Brewer, the former priest. Bart was ordained as a Discalced Carmelite in 1957. He was from Philadelphia. But later, when he left the Catholic Church, for a while became Seventh-day Adventist and then became Independent Baptist, he ended up affecting one of these kind of southern drawls because that was sort of expected of a preacher in that milieu.
Right.
Okay. And his was a very sad case because he died, so far as I know, unreconciled.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because we think about, we were talking about the idea of EWTN's expansion globally and around the world and reaching out, and thanks to the Holy Spirit and Mother Angelica's mission, we're doing that. But it's interesting because, the TBNs of the world and a lot of the Protestant television as well, if even more so, have spread around the country.
Yes.
And what you see sometimes is an in-country version of what looks like Southern evangelical or fundamentalists, where they actually wear the same kind of hair or same kind of clothes, and I guess even have that same kind of presentational quality to it.
Amen, brother.
Right.
It's that kind of thing replicated, whether it's in South America or Asia or someplace else. Yes, yes.
It's interesting how that plays itself out. Now, you said here in this introduction before you had, I think this is the one with, it was Bart Brewer, right? Yeah. You said the idea of there would have been more Catholics in attendance. There was 350 people there, no more than 50. There would have been more Catholics if the diocesan paper advertised the debate in its upcoming events column the way the main secular daily did, as if more parishes had published notices in their Sunday bulletins. All had press releases in ample time, and this was interesting, but there long had been in official Catholic circles almost a denial that fundamentalism was wooing Catholics away from the church of their upbringing, and even clerics who admitted such a problem existed tended to prefer a policy of benign neglect or were skittish about anything deemed controversial, and what's more controversial than a controversy. And I don't know if it was this particular one that some priest said he was going to come and then decided not to come. So that's a problem you experience not only with that, but my guess is in many ways
in those
in general.
years, especially.
Do you still see that or not as much?
Not so much anymore.
Okay.
No. But that's because lay folks have been doing apologetics now for 40 years, and it's become re-legitimized. You know, apologetics used to be part of seminary training until the 1950s or so. And then there's a generation of priests for whom it became a kind of dirty word. And they thought there was something wrong with defending and explaining the faith as such. Okay, and make nice and that'd be enough. But it turned out it wasn't enough, because we found later generations left the church because the faith wasn't defended. Okay, but now in the last several decades, there's been that defense chiefly from lay people, and it's widespread in the U.S. now and elsewhere, and it's re-legitimized the practice of apologetics. So now I don't see that kind of issue so much with priests the way I once did when I began.
Right, especially I would think with the younger priests too.
Oh,
I
no
think
problem with the younger
John Paul
priests.
II
No problem.
generation who grew up under
because
him.
many of them actually give what I call apologetics homilies.
Right.
You know, they'll engage in apologetics in addition to the standard part of the homily.
If you're not prepared to defend what you believe, as First Peter would say, then why would you bother becoming a priest anymore?
You would imagine.
It's not exactly the most socially, acceptable
not anymore.
position.
No. Now, when you're becoming ordained, you're coming in already with, in terms of our society, with a kind of black mark.
Right, exactly.
Okay? And so there's a little level of persecution you take on from day one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the one with Bart Brewer, you said, many former Catholics came up to me and said they wish someone had told them about the church while they were still in it. A Catholic whom I hadn't seen for many years confided that she had been tempted to unpope, but that debate broke the spell. So you've got two different sides there. I think your work, Scott Hahn and many others, Pat Madrid's work, the idea of reinforcing in Catholics who were questioning and thinking to say, okay, I knew what I believe was true. Now I understand why it's true and why other things that are being said, the proof texts being thrown at me aren't quite,
Right.
Because I remember one debate with one particular apologist when he was being challenged. He said, well, you're jumping around and just pulling things from one book or another book and that are totally unrelated and putting them together as if it was written that way. It wasn't.
No, but that technique has been very effective in drawing not well-informed Catholics out of the church. So when Catholics can hear a debate or read a debate where things are put together for them and they have a couple issues resolved, that's enough to keep them in, and then maybe they'll be inclined to start doing some homework on their own.
Now, in what way did Bart Brewer remind you of Dickens' Uriah Heep, as opposed to the rock and roll band, but the character?
The character in Dickens' novel is a kind of stuffy, not over-the-top character, but a little condescending in a way. And this is the way Bart was when he spoke about how much he loved Catholics, even though he clearly hated the Catholic Church. At least that's the way his words came out. So he would say on the one hand how much he loved Catholics, but it was the church he opposed. But the way he opposed it, with often vitriolic language, made you wonder how he could ever really love an individual Catholic.
Now, do you do debates still? Do you go out and do any of those?
I don't anymore, no. I might in the future.
Okay.
But
this is the other question I have for you, since you answered that so well. And it was something I always thought with Pat Madrid. How do you stay so composed? Because I've listened to I've read the transcripts, but I remember listening to some of these, which were quite lively. Bart Brewer going on for 90 minutes, etc. But how do you, when you've got the whole crowd against you, things are being said that are quite disparaging many times about Catholicism, how do you keep from losing your temper?
I'd like to say it's grace, but in fact it's probably more fear. And there was one time I lost my temper in the debate against the Iglesia Ni Cristo minister. The only time in public I've ever done so. He had seconds at his table helping him. And one of those guys.
And what do you mean by that, seconds?
Seconds in debate terminology is somebody who assists the chief debater, passing information and so on. We weren't supposed to have that. It was supposed to be mano a mano, one-on-one. Right. But he had two other guys on his table helping him. And at one point, I'm at the lectern in the front talking. One of his seconds stands up and interrupts me and starts talking over me. And I remember I pointed to him and said, "Sit down, be quiet. I'm debating him, not you."
Right.
Okay. That was the only time I lost my temper.
Right.
Okay. But otherwise, I think, I like to think it's grace, but I think also it simply was a fear of putting the church in a bad light. Mm-hmm. Because I wanted people to listen to what I said and what the church says. I didn't want them to walk away saying, I guess the Catholic faith must be untrue because this guy was rude or whatever. Okay, I didn't want that to happen.
Did you ever, in all the time you were doing this, have anyone inside the church or even major Catholics who might have said to you, why are you stirring things up like this?
Actually, no.
Mm-hmm.
I had a sense that there were priests and higher-ups who sort of liked the fact that somebody else was doing this.
A nod and a wink. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So that. Now, other books by Karl Keating. Now, there's one book you did a couple of years ago that struck me, and I haven't had a chance to read it, but on the new Geo Centrists. Mm-hmm. What's a Geo Centrist? Why are they new, and why were you writing about it?
There's a movement within one element of Catholicism and Protestantism that says the Earth is the physical center of the universe, mm-hmm. and that the sun, the planets, and all the stars revolve around a stationary Earth. Mm-hmm. This is, of course, believed centuries ago, mm-hmm. But it's not something that the church teaches or ever did teach formally. But these people have gone out, and whether they're Catholics or Protestants, have said Christians have to believe this astronomical theory to be good Christians because the Bible teaches it. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a book disputing that. So it's part science, it's part theology.
Why would you think people would get caught up in something like that?
Because I think there's a tendency for people, it's kind of Gnosticism. They want to have a secret understanding of something that other people don't understand. Mm-hmm. There's an attraction to that. There's been since the early history of the church, even before the church. Mm-hmm. So we had the early history of Gnosticism as a heresy. Mm-hmm. But Gnosticism means secret knowledge.
Right.
So if I know something that you don't, or society in general doesn't, that builds me up.
Right.
And so in the science, quasi-science area of geocentrism, I think one of the attractions is I'm right and all these other guys, Einstein and all these others, they're wrong. Mm-hmm. I've got the inside track.
But it would seem today in dealing with what we're dealing with the new atheism, I get to do a show with Father Robert Spitzer, Father Spitzer's Universe, which is the intersection of faith and reason. Part of it is to show how they go together and how science does not contradict. And when you come up with things that seem to be obviously contradicting science, it seems like it would undercut your faith perspective.
You think, but there's no contradiction. Mm-hmm. In all of history, the only time we can find a supposed contradiction is the Galileo case, mm-hmm. which wasn't really that at all. But if you look at history, the church has been the promoter and defender of science, mm-hmm. never an opponent.
Right, exactly. Now, this book itself that we're talking about today, Debating Catholicism, 4 books in one. So was it originally published as individual books?
I published each debate separately, and then I put them together in this omnibus volume.
Okay, which is the one we're talking about. Now, are you planning on doing that as well for some other debates you have?
Maybe not for other debates because I have some difficulty accessing the transcripts, but I'm doing the kind of thing for other series of books that I'm doing where I'm having some shorter books that will combine as an omnibus.
Well, let's talk about you being a writer. Now, you wrote 2 books early on, Catholicism, Fundamentalism, and then
what Catholics really believe.
What they believe. So one was your big seller. One sold about half as much, but was still a pretty big seller.
Right.
And since how many years later? Wasn't there a span there between writing those books and your new books?
There was. I had a few books in between, but until recent years, I hadn't been writing that much because I had administrative duties and other things. Right. But now I'm freed up, and so I'm focusing on books.
Now, when you write, how do you write? Where do you write?
I wish I were like the late Ralph McInerney of Notre Dame, who every evening would go to his basement and write 750 words standing up before he'd go to bed. He ended up writing about 100 books, most of them novels. I'm not that disciplined. So I go in spurts. I can be working for several days and do a lot of writing, and then I have a day where I can't get a word down. So, and normally I write several books simultaneously. It's not the smart thing to do. Right. It's just the way I work.
Right. So do you hike or fly your plane when maybe you need to?
I no longer fly, but I hike. I'm heading out in a couple of days for a week-long High Sierra hike.
Right.
So,
Do you find that to be a spiritual experience as well?
it is. I think you can't go to where I hike and not believe that God exists. This stuff didn't happen accidentally.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sure you being an apologist isn't as accidental as you might have thought. Karl Keating, always a pleasure to see
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you so much. Don't be shy about showing up at EWTN again. We love having you. Karl Keating, the one and only Debating Catholicism, 4 books in one, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. Check it out. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark. Thanks for being with us.